In May 1944, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm was on the back foot, but it was still quite dangerous. Just because the Allies had broken the back of the Wolfpack's offensive against the convoys hadn't stopped the Germans continuing to innovate and try and find new methods to try and return their operational conditions to something that was a little bit more like the favourable ones of the first few years of the war. Of course, the Allies were also keeping up in the technological arms race and still trying to sink as many enemy submarines as possible, since every submarine lost usually meant that the crew were either dead or captured, which doubly reduced the effectiveness of the U-boats, as fewer operational submarines meant fewer merchants hit and fewer targets for an ever-increasing number of escorts to chase. And new subs would be hard-pressed to find experienced crews to operate them, even if they were more technically advanced, which made the chances of the new subs' detection and destruction before the crews had a chance to gain much experience much, much higher. Indeed, by this point, although there had already been serious casualties, there was a rapidly opening gap between the submarines that had commissioned pre-war or in the first couple of years of the war and had managed to survive this far, which now tended to continue to survive, netting themselves a dozen or more patrols, and the much newer, and as said in theory more advanced submarines that were commissioning in 1943 and 1944, but many of whom were vanishing on their first or second patrols. Part of the reason for this was that for some time the Allies had been generally able to read the Kriegsmarine's codes thanks to the efforts of the decryption teams at Bletchley Park in the UK. In more recent years, this had been coupled by an increasing number of escorts and escort carriers, which had in turn allowed the implementation of dedicated hunter-killer groups which could pursue and hunt U-boats away from the convoy lanes. One such intercepted signal indicated that there were a number of U-boats operating at or near the Cape Verde Islands, and the US Navy sent out Task Group 22.3 to deal with them. This consisted of the new escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, the Edsall-class destroyer escorts Pillsbury, Pope, Flaherty and Chatelaine, and the Buckley-class destroyer escort USS Jenks. Between high-frequency direction finding, their own ship's radars, and the Guadalcanal's air group, which was made up of a mixture of F-4F Wildcats, primarily useful for self-defense and high-speed reconnaissance, and TBM Avengers, which could carry more serious anti-submarine payload but were slower and more maintenance-intensive, the group began its search for enemy submarines. But they were also looking to attack in a very specific way. Although new, this was not Guadalcanal's first rodeo. She had in fact commissioned in September 1943 under the command of Captain Daniel V. Gallery, who'd spent the past few years being in charge of the PBY Catalinas that flew from Iceland on anti-submarine patrols. In 2 cruises between that commissioning and now, he'd managed to sink 3 U-boats and damaged another, while managing to keep aircraft aloft continuously for 48 hours during his second cruise, and in that period, this covered the hunt for the 2 subs that were claimed during that cruise. This was a very early example of escort carriers undertaking nighttime operations. It was this second cruise, particularly the attack on U-505, which had caught Gallery's attention. Using the full range of both his carrier's capabilities and those of his escorts, they'd managed to track and attack U-515 for around 18 hours, eventually running the submarine out of battery power and forcing it to surface in the middle of the escort group. As was standard practice, absolutely everybody who had a bead on it immediately opened fire, and U-515 was quickly mortally damaged. But Gallery mused that if they could find and pin down another U-boat in a similar manner, and then anticipate when the sub might be forced to surface, instead of then blowing it out of the water, they could have boarding parties standing by to capture the submarine, which would hopefully then be full of the latest German secrets. In order to do this, the sub would still need to be fired on when it rose up out of the water, but only with light weapons. This would be enough to keep the submarine's crew away from the deck guns, and ideally encourage them to make a jump into the sea rather quickly. But nothing like 3-inch or 5-inch armour-piercing ammunition, which might actually sink the target. In aid of this, Gallery ordered every destroyer escort to have a boat or 2 with boarding parties pre-selected and ready at the appropriate time, and to also have pre-prepared towing equipment rigged. Initially, though, the group patrolled the target waters for a fortnight and found nothing. Running low on fuel, they decided to head for Casablanca, but on the way there, reports came in of a submarine that was trying to sneak home via the west coast of Africa. Judging they had enough of a margin of fuel reserve to do a bit of searching whilst they were heading vaguely in the direction of their refuelling port, Gallery ordered the searches to be run. For most of the subsequent week, there were little ghostly traces, radar contacts that vanished if you got too close, or sonar contacts that faded, then pulsed back into life again, only to turn out to be noisemakers. Quick radio bursts that high-frequency direction finding could give you a fix on, but the fixes were always just that little bit too far away to get to in time. With their fuel reserves now effectively gone, the disappointed group set a more direct course for Casablanca, with the only active searching now going on being a few of the Wildcats, which were being kept aloft, mostly to guard against German missile-armed bombers who might show up. Then, on June the 4th, 1944, just after 1100 in the morning, the Chatelaine reported a possible sonar contact. Quickly, they decided this was a definite sonar contact and, in fact, a U-boat. Chatelaine, Pillsbury and Jenks moved into attack while Guadalcanal broke off to open up the distance, with Pope and Flaherty in close escort. Even as the carrier fell back, she had ordered the Wildcats and an Avenger in to assist. These radioed that they could see a submarine running at full speed just under the surface. According to Gallery's report, what happened next was very fast. Determining that the sub was running shallow to avoid depth charges, Chatelaine fired her Hedgehog mortars, but these missed. The submarine returned fire with an acoustic homing torpedo and then tried to break off. The Chatelaine was forced to evade and thus lost contact, but the aircraft had been watching the whole thing, and they told the ship where to go, partially by radio and partially by having Wildcats dive and fire bursts of machine gun rounds into the sea directly over the submarine. The U-boat was diving for the safety of deeper waters when Chatelaine caught up and sent a full spread of depth charges over her sides and stern. An upwelling of oil was quickly followed by an upwelling of submarine and a hail of 50 caliber, 20mm, 40mm, and the occasional 3-inch high explosive shell was sent down range as U-505 broke the surface. Apparently, the depth charging had been very close, pitching the sub over on its side, and so many things had been broken or damaged, and the captain believed that the submarine was fatally injured, and so the crew promptly escaped out of the conning tower and dove overboard the moment that they could. This meant that the normal scuttling procedures were not fully carried out. A few valves had been wedged open, but that was pretty much it. Even the engines were still left running, and with the steering being jammed by the explosions, it meant that while Jenks and Chatelaine headed to pick up the German sailors in the water, Pillsbury was left having to work out how to board U-505, which was now merrily charging around in a circle, completely unmanned and somewhat heavily down by the stern. Thinking there must be some crew still aboard, maybe trying to bring the submarine around to make an attack, Pillsbury cut across the submarine's wake, took an inside racing line on the circle it was doing, caught up, overhauled it, and then lowered a boat with 9 men aboard, which made a near-perfect intercept, with the boarding party finding 1 man aboard the sub dead, the only casualty of the engagement, and then a bunch of them jumped down the conning tower hatch with hand grenades and small arms ready to take the fight to anyone who was left on board. Of course, what actually happened is they ended up ordering the darkness to stick 'em up, as there was nothing but the sound of purring diesels and lapping water left inside the hull. Cautious of potential traps, the boarding party carefully advanced through the sub, shutting valves and covers as they went. But, even as they moved through, the extra weight of water was making the sub sink lower and lower by the stern, until the part of the boarding party who had been left up on the deck had to close the conning tower hatch to stop the waves overtopping it, getting in, and definitely sending the sub to the bottom. With the flooding finally stopped internally, the next order of business was to try and stop the sub from moving. But the moment they accomplished this, it took on a very alarming tilt even further down by the stern, and so the engines had to be run up again, which allowed the stern planes to provide a little bit of counterforce, and put the sub on a slightly more even footing. Pillsbury now tried to take the sub under tow, but with the U-boat still motoring around in an eternal circle, all she got for her troubles was a gash in the hull from where the sub's bow planes cut into the destroyer escort when they got a little bit too close. Realizing the sub needed to stay moving in order to stay afloat, at least until pumping could be arranged, but with the mass difference between a destroyer escort and a Type 9C not all that great, the Guadalcanal now moved in. The sub was temporarily stopped, the escort carrier got a tow line attached, and then rapidly sped up again, hauling the sub along, which, thanks to its still damaged rudder, meant that the sub streamed out to the aft starboard quarter a bit like a giant paravane. Leaving the damaged Pillsbury in the care of one of her compatriots, the rest of the group set course for Casablanca, having to stop that night to reattach a tow line when the original one parted. Once they were underway again, it rapidly became clear the carrier was likely to run out of long enough sections of decent rope long before they got back to base, as the sub was constantly pulling and yanking away to starboard. The problem they had was the bridge indicator said the rudder was amidships, which it blatantly was not, but the only way to correct this was to get into the aft torpedo room where you could manually adjust the steering gear. And they hadn't gone in there because they thought it might have been booby-trapped as the door was shut. However, the German crew, who were now prisoners, said that it wasn't. The door had been shut because they thought that section of the sub was flooded. As it turned out, no one was correct. The door was indeed shut, but not trapped, and the only thing it was doing was holding back rather non-existent water. And so, once opened, this allowed the crew to center the rudder, which at least meant they weren't going to run out of tow cable anytime soon. But it also turned out that one of the aft ballast tanks had been ruptured in the depth charge attack, and this was the primary reason for the heavy stern trim. Then the group's orders were changed again. Now they were to go to Bermuda, as it was not felt that the recently liberated Vichy French ports would be secure enough to conceal the capture of the U-boat. Thinking one step ahead as regards the group's fuel limits, they were informed that a tug was being sent out to tow the U-boat, and a fleet oiler would top up all the ship's tanks. By the time all this had been sorted out, Pillsbury had managed to patch herself up and caught up with the rest of the group, and along the way to Bermuda they met the tug USS Abnaki. But the brief pause to transfer tow cables almost saw U-505 slip below the surface again, and so they found themselves having to conduct mid-ocean underway salvage, removing anything heavy but vaguely portable from the sub generally, but the aft sections especially, and transferring portable pumps from other ships to remove every trace of water they could find from inside the hull. The USS Humboldt also arrived, and all the secret paperwork and the Enigma machines were removed from the sub and sent on ahead aboard the USS Jenks. The sum total of these efforts yielded a slightly more level submarine that was now pronounced suitable for the rest of the Atlantic Passage. Absolute secrecy was declared. After all, if it became known that the sub had been captured intact, then the Germans would of course make changes to everything from their radar detectors to the Enigma machines. And this meant that the submarine's crew would be kept separately and secretly from the rest of the prisoner of war population. The sub itself was kept at Bermuda and promptly repainted to look, at least from a distance, a bit like a US sub, and was then studied intensively. These secretive efforts worked, as at the end of the war, Pillsbury was in the position to take the surrender of one of the surviving U-boats and discovered that the submarine's captain was a former executive officer of U-505, and the lieutenant who led the boarding party onto U-505 was actually still aboard Pillsbury and was also sent out to accept this submarine's surrender as well. He casually asked the U-boat commander what had happened to his old sub, and the Kriegsmarine officer informed him that, to the best of his knowledge, U-505 had been lost with all hands about a year earlier. As it was, U-505's crew were only sent home, and thus the secret exposed, a couple of years after the war had ended. U-505 itself, though, was now seen as surplus to requirements. She'd been completely examined in the period up to the end of World War II, and now there was a brand new generation of Axis submarines to poke around in, and so she was listed for disposal as a target. However, Gallery was, by the late 1940s, a rear admiral, and he didn't want to see all of his hard effort go to waste. Luckily, his brother happened to know the head of the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, which already wanted to have a submarine to show off. The US Navy wanted to get rid of this particular submarine, and so the match was ideal. $250,000 was raised by the people of Chicago to tow the submarine from the Maine-New Hampshire border area, where she was rusting away, up the rivers and through the locks to reach Chicago on the Great Lakes. And so, in 1954, she was fished out of the water and stuck on display outside, after a little bit of a refit, as almost everything that could be moved had been moved and removed by the US Navy. So replacement parts had to be sourced from the German manufacturers who'd made the originals, and as it turned out, they were quite happy to help. For the next half-century or so, the sub sat outside, but by 2004 it was clear that the weather was getting the better of her, and so she was cleaned up, given some new paint, and moved to an underground display room built specifically for her, which is where you can still find her today, and where I visited her in September 2023. Now, as you approach this particular gallery, which is of course part of the much larger museum, one of the first things you'll run into is this video presentation, which goes over a very brief story about how U-505 ended up being captured. And as you can see, it's kind of modelled on the open bridge of one of the ships involved in the capture of U-505 at the time. And nearby, they've also got examples of Hedgehog mortar rounds and this, as you can see, a Mark 9 Mod 3 depth charge. So this is the kind of depth charge that the Chatelaine was sending over the side to go after U-505. And then, of course, you come out, if you followed the signage properly, to this viewing gallery. Now, this is done really well. As you can see, there is the sub. And where it's possible, now obviously for the really, really big ships it's not possible, but where it is possible, I actually do think the interior display of ships works very much in their favour, not just from a preservation perspective, because obviously it can be climate controlled. So you've got, like U-505 here, what's left of the Batavia in Australia, Vasa over in Sweden, Mary Rose in the UK. But you also get a little bit more of an appreciation of the scale of the vessel, because whilst obviously having a ship in the water or adjacent to the water in the open air is a bit more of its natural operating environment, it can sometimes be possible for the ship to be overwhelmed by the surrounding area, and thus you don't really get a true relative scale of what it would have been like at the time to see that vessel. For example, HMS Victory at the time was one of the largest and most powerful ships on the planet. She wasn't the absolute largest or absolute most powerful first rate, but she's up there. But if you visit her on a day where, say, one of the Queen Elizabeth class carriers is in Portsmouth, those things, they outmass her by at least a factor of 20. And interestingly enough, you could actually fit Victory bow to stern across the Queen Elizabeth's flight deck, port to starboard, and still have space to go around either side. Now, what I'm getting at there is that if you've got something like a 60+ thousand ton fleet carrier sitting a few hundred yards away, it can make poor old Victory look a little bit small. Whereas, thanks to the way that our brains perceive perspective, if you put a submarine like U-505 or a ship like Vasa, etc., in a building that is only just a little bit bigger than the vessel is, we appreciate how big the room is, because unless you live your entire life in one of the world's biggest Walmarts, this kind of hangar-sized structure is not really a commonplace experience. And then we see this vessel filling most of it. You think, this is a truly gigantic vessel, even if in the grand scheme of things it might not actually be. But it's a very, very effective way of presenting it to the general public and getting them to appreciate it a bit more. And as you can see, that's what they've done with U-505 here. And you can even see down there at the bow, they've even given her a torpedo mid-launch, if you will. So as you come around the viewing gallery, you will end up gradually working your way down to the lower floor. But as you can see, there's the torpedo sticking out which we might have a bit of a closer look at later on. And there's those bow planes, there's that little guard fin which took out a chunk of poor old Pillsbury just there in the centre of this particular photo. Now, to actually get aboard U-505, which you can do, you have to book a separate ticket. So obviously you need admission generally to the museum, but then you also need to book a specific timed tour because it is a submarine. It's not the world's largest environment. And, well, they want you to not be like the late 1940s US Navy and steal everything that you could possibly unbolt. So they insist on small timed guided tour groups, which we did have tickets for. And I say we because I was exceptionally lucky not just to be seeing U-505, but also to be meeting a rather excellent gentleman. Now, some of you may have heard of his name before. He co-authored A Shattered Sword, and he has another book coming out at some point in the near future about 1942. He is, of course, John Partial, and he was exceptionally kind and decided to come up and say hello and visit me and basically hang around while we were at U-505, which was absolutely great because, you know, there's that old saying, you never meet your heroes. Thus far, at least in naval history terms, I can say I'm bucking the trend on that because every one of the authors of, those books that I've read and the books that I reference when I talk about the stuff that we talk about on this channel have all turned out to be really nice gentlemen. And John Partial stands, head and shoulders above even many of those. They're all wonderful people, but John is a really, really nice person. If you ever get a chance to meet him, absolutely recommend it. It was also absolutely hilarious to see some of the subscribers who came to say hi do a double take when they realised that, yes, they're talking to me, but also John Partial is standing right next to me. That's the opportunity you really should be taking. I turn up in the United States like a bit like a bad penny. There's not many opportunities you'll get a chance to have a word with someone like John in a setting like this. And all of this has brought us all the way round to the back of U-505, which you can see, unlike U-534 in the UK, is intact. I suppose not having depth charge land on your upper deck and roll off and detonate right next to you probably helps in that regard. Now, while we were queuing up for our first pass through the sub, I had to laugh at this little certificate that was just opposite the entrance, which is cut into the hull right up forward. As you can see, it says that occupancy by more than 30 persons is dangerous and unlawful, which, of course, given that Type 9C sub like U-505 carried significantly more than that during World War II, technically means that, if the certificating board could reach back through time, they'd be issuing the Kriegsmarine with many, 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 many citations against unsafe work practices for running a U-boat with too many people aboard, apart from the unsafe work practice of sending people out in U-boats in late World War II Atlantic warfare. Now, this is going to be a relatively abbreviated tour of the sub because, as you know, I have a policy against showing everything in a museum ship because people should go and see the museum ship as best they can, but give people enough of a highlight that if there's no chance of you ever actually seeing it, you get some idea of what's there. But there's not really a huge amount inside Type 9C, so, well, here's the front. You can't actually go in this space, it is barriered off, but you can always take photos over the barriers. This is, of course, the forward torpedo room and also forward accommodation for a portion of the crew. Now, one thing that a lot of you who've been to other museum subs, in fact, almost any other museum sub in the world, will immediately notice is that there really isn't a huge amount of room. So if we were on one of the many Gato or Balao class museum subs, they're also in the US, like, say, USS Silversides, which is the next up in this America tour series, you'd have 6 torpedo tubes here and an awful lot more machinery and space around them. Instead, you just have the 4, and as you can see, we're pretty much, that is the width of the pressure hull at this point. And this is a Type 9C. This is not the small German sub. The small German sub is the Type 7. The 9C is a considerably larger vessel, so this was luxurious posting by German standards. And again, trust me, when you see this one day and you're on Silversides the next day, I mean, A World War II submarine of any description is not particularly large, but Silversides feels like a palace compared to 505. And that's with 505 having been made more visitor friendly. There's a little bit extra width in some of the hatchways and doorways. There's considerably more space vertically because they've taken out some of the grating, the deck grating, because they're not storing obviously months and months of food supplies underneath it, etc. This here, as you can see, is some of the transfer mechanism for reloading torpedoes. So obviously all the bunks would have to be folded out of the way when they're in combat operations. But you can see here, you've got chain falls on the left, you've got a mounting hoop on the right. So torpedoes would obviously be stored in the forward torpedo room for reloads. And this is why when you actually look at the number of torpedo tubes a submarine carried in the Second World War, you realize they would only have, in most subs, 2 or 3, sometimes even only 1 reload per tube. Torpedoes are very big weapons and submarines are not that large. Speaking of things that aren't that large, German U-boat galley cooks, because, well, there's the stove, and yeah, there's some ovens underneath it. And yes, that space in front of it, between it and this storage cupboard to the left, that is the space you have to operate in if you're the one who's cooking the food for the men on the U-boat. So if you're someone who likes to sample as you cook, your career in the Kriegsmarine U-boat flotilla is not going to be a very long one. You'll also notice the valves and levers above where the cook would be standing above their head. This sub is 100% utilitarian and functional. There's operational components everywhere. And while we're on the subject of utilitarian and functional, this is one of the nicer quarters aboard the sub. And as you can see from the curve there, this photo encompasses about 2/3 of the pressure hull. So unlike a lot of subs where perhaps, say, officers' quarters might be off to one side with a passage going down the other side of the sub, no, here you just have a couple of bunks and a little privacy curtain, and there's people just walking past you. This area is, however, wood-panelled, wood-lined, with a nice little wooden cupboard, so this is how you know this is one of the classier areas of the sub. Now, according to my big plan of Type 9C U-boats, immediately aft of the galley and the accommodation areas that we've just been through, there should be a listening room for the hydrophones and a radio room. One of them would be to port, one would be to starboard of the central gangway. Based on the equipment that's here, particularly that little set of headphones down on the bottom left attached to that blue device, I think that this is the portside listening room, i.e. where the sub would listen for anything from the propellers of merchant ships to the splash of depth charges. And this, on the opposite side, would be the radio room, more so because this looks like it has a lot more code book stuff. It's got a typewriter there for messages, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult to take notes when you have one compartment opposite the other when you're in the middle of a tour on a very cramped U-boat. And very shortly after that, you find yourself in the command and control center. Now, you might recognize these two devices if you've seen one of my Friday videos from about a year and a half ago. These are the steering devices. So instead of having a ship's wheel, this is what German U-boats use to steer. You press one of the big bronze knobs there, to the one on the left, obviously, to steer left, one on the right to steer right. You have a kind of sort of wheel thing to hold on to and to shield them. And also I have one of these, not one of the ones out of U-505, but one of the ones out of U-534 that's still sitting around in my house if I want to pretend the house is a U-boat, unless and until Western Approaches Command and Big Heritage, the guys who run the U-534 at the moment, decide they want it back. And all the various gauges, of course, everything is in German. So as you can see here, this is for engine control. This is your engine telegraph. Zurück being a reverse, voraus being forward, and as you can see, they've got a bunch of additional notifications separate from just going forward and back. Rather, obviously, there's the diesel motor engaged, so that's obviously for when the sub's on the surface. It's currently set to stop. You've got Achtung, obviously warning or look out, presumably to get the engine room ready to do something. Tauchen means dive, so prepare to dive or we're diving. So just a little bit more complicated than a surface ship's telegraph there. And this is just part of the rest of the controls in the command and control center. So you can see you've got various lights telling you that either things are good or possibly bad, depending on which light is illuminated or depending on what it's monitoring. It could also be something is open or closed, various valves that you have to dial open and close as well. And this is, as I say, probably 10-15% of all the controls scattered around here on the bulkheads of the sub. So in combat, in much worse lighting than this, you would somehow have to remember what all of these do and make sure you get the right ones, which would be especially fun with all the valves you can see there in the center bottom, because you don't want to necessarily open or close the wrong one when your life might depend on it. And the reason this little thing down on the floor is highlighted is because this is a bilge strainer. This is pretty much in the state that it was found when the sub was boarded, and this was the source of the majority of the 30 to 40 tons of water that actually got into the sub before everything was closed off. But as it turned out, even though that's kind of an 8-inch wide gap in which is obviously letting water in, they literally had just left the cover right next to it, as opposed to just chucking it somewhere else in the sub where it'd be much, much harder to find. And so the American boarding party just went, well, okay, I guess that goes on there. These butterfly screws tighten it all up and it's all shut off. Which, as we've seen, although it wasn't easy, it at least meant that U-505 didn't sink immediately. And then, obviously, passing a number of other compartments and controls, we come to the main diesel engine room. Now, when I went on U-534 and everything was rusted up, I did make a mistake in that I thought this was the engine room and the main engine room, and then further back came across what I thought was the electric motors. Made a complete pig's ear of it. Although Type 9Ds did carry multiple sets of diesels in an attempt to have a cruising high speed and battery charging sets, the Type 9C, of which U-505 and C-42, which U-534 is part of, they didn't have 6 sets of diesels. These are the main ones, but the electric motors are much, much smaller and look very, very different. But in any case, it all runs to the drive shaft. Obviously, being a Type 9, it has 2 propellers. This is part of that assembly going further aft still. And that then runs out of the hull underneath where this photo is taken, because this is the absolute aft of the submarine. Again, more accommodation. Torpedoes would have been stored here in wartime, because back there are the 2 aft torpedo tubes. So this is a much smaller, much narrower section of the sub, miniature version of the torpedo room we saw up front. And then when you get out of the sub at the back, you can see where that propeller shafting continues, as you can see exiting out of this gland in the side of the submarine, or underside, I suppose, really, and continuing off. Now, again, if you remember my tour of U-534, this outer winding or binding on the propeller shaft was in part destroyed. It was very badly damaged during the depth charge attack on 534, so all of this has sprung loose, but on 505 it's all still in place, which provides quite an interesting contrast. And of course, each propeller shaft, in this case the portside one, ends in a 3-bladed propeller, which then shoves water back straight over the stern planes, the stern hydroplanes, which obviously gives them a fair degree of authority. Now, they're not mounted out in the slightly easier flow on the very outer edges of the submarine hull, but obviously, as long as those propellers are turning, there's a bit more force and therefore authority to them as compared to being just out in the natural flow of things. And directly behind those are the 2 rudders, which you can see, obviously this is again at the port side, with the port side torpedo tube visible just tucked inside the rudder shaft there. And this is what the whole assembly looks like when you're viewing from almost, not quite, but almost a direct astern angle. But that's not it. It's not just a pretty view from up top and going through the sub. As you can see off to the right of this picture, there's a whole gallery next to the sub, which is made up in large part of artifacts removed from the sub and explained in a bit more detail. And of course that includes the Enigma rotor wheels, the spare ones. You can see one's been disassembled, so you can see how it works kind of in here. You've also got a code book, one of the things that should have been destroyed. You can see it's got lead edging to help it sink if you chucked overboard. and 2 fully working Enigma machines, although of course they're not going to let you play with them, but it gives you some idea of what was recovered. Now, being relatively late in the war and having had a number of German subs already captured with their Enigma machines in many cases still functioning, the capture of U-505 didn't yield massive additional secrets in terms of the Enigma coding devices themselves. It wasn't a kind of, we need these devices or we're not going to be able to read German codes. They already could, the Allies. But what this did is it confirmed that the Germans were still using roughly the same technology, and the code books and the correspondence were obviously very helpful in cross-checking and making sure that the methods of encoding hadn't got any different, and also obviously giving a few sets of settings which would be used to very rapidly plough through a whole load of German codes. And for the forward on the hull of the sub itself, you can see this interesting thing protruding out the bottom. Now, at some point, either in the interwar period or during World War II itself, depending on which nation you're looking at, hydrophones go from being their own system as distinct from active sonar, what the British would be calling ASDIC at the time, over to a more properly integrated system and become what we would more properly nowadays call passive sonar, i.e. you listen rather than emit for sound signals. And this dome attached to the later or surviving Type 9s, this allows you to mostly do the passive sonar thing, with, you can see all the little transceivers there. And this apparently did also have an active unit, although German submarines essentially never used it because it was a big, hey look, I'm over here guys, sign for anyone with working passive sonar, which was pretty much all the Allied escorts by that point. This is distinct from the somewhat more advanced system that we found on the Type 21s, obviously. And that's going to pretty much wrap us up for our look around U-505. Again, as I say, sorry to not include a bunch of other stuff that I have photos from, both from the external and internal displays, but with all being in one gallery and ultimately it being a not massive submarine, if I showed you the rest, I'd have pretty much shown you everything there is to see in that gallery, at which point I think the Chicago Museum would be a little bit annoyed with me. But as you can see from this other gallery in the Chicago Museum of Science, there's a whole lot of other interesting stuff to go see. So thanks very much to those of you who actually popped down to say hi at various points while we were in the gallery and in and around outside the gallery as well. It's always great to meet up with subscribers and chat to people in the shadow of actual history. And of course, once again, thanks very much to John Parshall for being kind enough to take a bit of time out of his day to come over and say hello in person as well. So, with all that said and done, on to USS Silversides next time we drop into American museum ships.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.